Over the last couple of years, I've looked at a bunch of different video game companies. All of them, or at least most of them, publish games for the Atari 2600. Stuff like 20th Century Fox, US Games, CBS, Imagic, all of those different companies. Pretty much all of them are out of business. I think there might be one or two that have moved into something else besides video games, but let's look at something that is still going on today and still making games. So we're going to be talking about Sega today. I wasn't expecting to see them as a publisher slash developer on the Atari 2600. I would have expected them to do something similar to what Nintendo did and just license out a bunch of their games to other companies so that they could port them over into the Atari and come up with a bunch of terrible ports. This isn't what happened, though. We instead have a rather interesting chapter in the history of Sega. The company's had a lot of interesting chapters over the years, especially in the 70s and 80s, as they were just doing whatever they wanted to do, mostly in the amusement sector, putting out jukeboxes, other arcade games, that sort of thing. Before we get into the games that they put out, let's talk a little bit about Gremlin and Sega. When you talk about Sega in the late 70s and early 80s, you really talk about two companies, Sega and Gremlin Industries. They would eventually merge into one after Sega bought Gremlin, and that gave Sega a lot of presence in North America. They would put out a lot of arcade games, both made by Sega and by Gremlin, and eventually it would just become Sega as Gremlin was slowly phased out. One of the big things that happened was they got a lot of manufacturing facilities in the United States, so they didn't have to worry about importing all the stuff and then assembling it later. They could actually make all the games in North America and distribute them that way. This version of Sega of America would be around from really the 70s until 1984 when the company went defunct and they sold everything off to Bally Midway. Bally Midway will come back later in this story. But in 1982, Sega would change their name to Sega Electronics. They would put out a bunch of ports of their arcade games to various home consoles and computers. They put out stuff for the Apple II, Commodore 64, all of the Atari 8-bit computers at the time, the VIC-20, the Atari 2600, and the Atari 5200. And of course, they still made a lot of arcade games throughout the 70s and 80s. Initially, it was Gremlin making these games, and then Sega would basically acquire all the IP from Gremlin, which they would later sell off after the company went defunct in 1984. Specifically, Sega Electronics went defunct, Sega of Japan would obviously keep going. On top of putting out their own arcade games, Sega would also be a publisher for other companies. Specifically, they publish games for Nintendo and also for Konami, as well as a few Namco titles. There was a lot in there that I wasn't expecting to see, and it's kind of cool to find out that Sega put out a bunch of stuff for other companies. You might wonder why Sega did this, and why a lot of these companies decided to have Sega publish their games. Well, it was because Sega had the infrastructure to do so. Companies like Konami and also Nintendo didn't have an infrastructure or presence in North America at the time, and because Sega had all those manufacturing facilities I mentioned earlier, they were able to actually pull this stuff off. This would change throughout the 80s, just as Sega retreated from the North American market, and other companies would continue to make stuff. You'll see a lot of this happen, like Bally Midway, they became a publisher for Namco as well, so a lot of those Pac-Man machines you'll see Bally Midway on. A lot of companies did this. It's kind of cool to see it, though, just because, well, it creates some interesting stories later on. When Sega pulled out of North America, All of their manufacturing stuff was sold off to Bally Midway, while Sega kept their game library. This was part of a pattern that Sega would do just throughout the 80s, and yeah, it makes their history a little confusing. Bally Midway would also get the right of first refusal to publish Sega's arcade games in North America. That's a story for another time. It's not a very interesting story, but it is kind of interesting. Sega would actually go on to publish some games that Bally Midway put out in the arcades on the home console. Games like Spy Hunter and Tapper were arcade games for Bally Midway, but Sega got the rights to the home console. And that's how you end up with Tapper on the Atari 2600. Sega published the port of it. Sega published 9 games for the Atari 2600. These were Buck Rogers' Planet of Zoom, Congo Bongo, Spy Hunter, Star Trek Strategic Operations Simulator, Subscan, TACScan, Tapper, Thunderground, and Up and Down. There were also several unreleased games that I'll mention later. As always, take the unreleased games with a grain of salt, and let me know if I missed any. Some of the lists that I've seen have included other games like Frogger. That was a game that Sega published in the arcades, but they didn't have the rights to the home console. That's why Parker Brothers published it. There is a story behind Frogger's licensing, and it's kind of interesting. Konami made the game and licensed it to Sega for an arcade release. Parker Brothers got the right to the Atari 2600 version, and this game could be the subject of its own video, so I'll kind of just leave it at that. Sega also sold the rights to some of their games to companies like Coleco. This is why you'll see games like Zaxxon and Carnival on a Coleco cartridge. You could see this as Sega seeing if there was any interest in their games on other home consoles, or them buying time to get a group of developers together to work on the ports themselves. There's a whole bunch of different reasons behind it. Maybe they just didn't feel like doing it for those games and wanted somebody else to put out an inferior port. Sega also got the rights to Tapper for a home console release. It's kind of cool. Originally it was supposed to be a marketing thing for Budweiser, and later it got changed to Mountain Dew when it was brought over to home consoles. As I mentioned, there were several unreleased games that were announced in 1983 for the Winter Consumer Electronics Show. Many of these games were mentioned specifically on page 45 of the April issue of Billboard magazine. I'm not sure if all of these have demos, but there are a few of them that do, and I haven't really tried those two out. So, both of those demos aren't really mentioned in this one, so they were probably mentioned in some other release, but it is rather interesting that Sega was announcing more games in 1983. So the unreleased games were Bear, I'm gonna say Ion? I'm not really sure how to pronounce that one. Airplane, Dragon Slayer, 48 Hours, Friday the 13th, which probably would have been awesome, Marathon Man, Star Trek The Wrath of Khan, Star Trek The Search for Spock, and War of the Worlds. I figured I'd put this here because there's just not enough information for me to make another video on this. But Gremlin had a subsidiary company called Noval, and this company made a computer called the Noval 760. It didn't last long, and when Sega bought Gremlin, they also ended up with the rights to this computer. The computer was discontinued in 1979, mostly because of sluggish sales. It was only on the market for 2 years. It's kind of a cool looking computer because it's the entire desk, and it's just wild that they thought that this was a good idea, because if you wanted to upgrade to a new computer, you needed to buy an entirely new desk. So while that might work for like an office furniture company, I have no idea why you would want to do this for a home computer or something like that. It looks really cool, but it's wildly impractical. There really isn't too much information past this. It got panned by a lot of critics. It's a very interesting piece of computer history, and it's really just an odd footnote in Sega's history. Even though Sega pretty much pulled out of North America in 1984, they didn't totally leave. They didn't have an office or as big of a presence there as they used to, but they were still releasing arcade games throughout the 80s and the 90s. They would try to come back first with the Master System, and that didn't really take off as well as they had hoped. Then they came back again with the Sega Genesis, and that worked out pretty well for them. That will have to be the subject of something in the future. But their time on the Atari 2600 was kind of interesting, and they put out some stuff that was fairly good at the time, or at least better than what some of the other companies were putting out. The 70s and 80s were really an interesting time for video games. This is just a small portion of what was really a fascinating thing for me to look into. I love Sega, and I didn't know too much about what they were doing on the Atari 2600. Mostly, I know more about their arcade stuff, but not so much really in the 80s and also into the 70s. I've read a few books about the history of Sega of America, and this part is usually glossed over in favor of those arcade games. So when I came across a few of the cartridges, I was a little surprised to see that they were a publisher, because I figured they would just have licensed all that stuff out. When these games were ported to the Atari, the system was really showing its age. They would have looked better, and they did actually look a lot better on stuff like the Intellivision or the ColecoVision, and they really looked a lot better on the home computers as well. There are a few things that I want to come back to at some point, like many of the other companies that I've looked at. They all have other stories that I think would be really interesting, but were kind of beyond the scope of what I was talking about here. So at some point, you might see something on like Frogger or even Konami's other games on the Atari 2600. But for right now, we're going to leave it there. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I will talk to you all later. Bye.